Let's welcome to the second lecture, and today we are going to be talking about some of the main tasks that we can carry out using ChatGPT. Okay, so let's see what is the main structures that we have today for today's lecture. So this lesson or this module comprises of some of the main tasks that we can do with ChatGPT. And one of the major tasks that we can do with ChatGPT, since it's a language model, is we can do language translation. So we can do conversion from, let's say, Hindi to English, then English to Chinese, and so forth and so on. And language translation is one of the main tasks that could be enabled by ChatGPT. And so we'll focus a little bit on how to do language translation, what are the functionalities, and what are the important things to consider when you are considering language translation. Okay. The second thing that we will cover about today is how we can start writing codes. ChatGPT has learned also from a lot of code bases in Python, HTML, and so forth and so on, and it really remarkably does well with code writing, and it's one of the main uses of ChatGPT nowadays for people who are writing code. And if you're a coder or a programmer, then you can take the use ChatGPT for various programming purposes. So that's the second task that we'll be focusing on in this lesson or this module that we have. Then the third is looking into some complex problems, right? And when say complex problems, I want to think about, planning problems, right? Like let's say a lot of things that we do requires a lot of planning, road mapping, and thinking. And most of the times we are using, our own planning algorithms, human planning algorithm based upon the information that we gather from different sources. And one of those sources could be, Google search and so forth and so on. But we do mainly the planning on our own. But as I will show that some of the planning, complex task plannings could be easily enabled using ChatGPT. So that's another category of uses in terms of complex planning problems is what we are going to be focusing on. Again, I will not be covering like some of the miscellaneous tasks that you can do. Hopefully, if time permits, then I will probably take another lecture. But we can also do text classification, sentiment analysis, and transfer learning. And so those are some of the miscellaneous tasks that could be done. If time permits, I will cover that. But I'm not planning to focus on this specific one. Okay. So let's move on and let's begin with the main task that we have at our hand. First task, which is essentially the language translation task. Okay, so when we talk about language translation, what is language translation? Very simple context is like, how do I translate something that is written in one language to another language? So here is an example saying hello, namaste, or siao. These are different translation of the same thing in different languages. So how can I take a text which is in one language and transfer it into a text in another language is the main purview of this language translation task. So that's one of the major primary tasks that you can do using ChatGPT. So let's focus on this and see what are the things that comes to mind. So first thing that I want to talk about when we are going to show that I'm going to show some examples where we can translate from Hindi to English. And the reason I'm doing it, you can do it for any other language. The reason I'm using Hindi to English is I understand Hindi a lot, and that would be a good example problem for me to play to understand the capabilities of ChatGPT. But you can take any other language and you can carry out the exercises that I'm showing here with respect to the language translation capability. Right. Another thing that we will do is like we will try to also understand how to compare translation capabilities of multiple different tools that are out there. Right. One of the things I will try to do is I will try to compare the translation ability of ChatGPT with the Google Translator, which is another translator. But if you are doing research, then in the research setting also, there are multiple other translators that are out there. In fact, I will point out to your research paper where there are more language translators that you can use for research purposes too. But generally what I will do is I will show you one of the state-of-the-art, widely used commercial solution, which is the Google Translator that we have. Let's move on and let's talk about the third thing. Again, when you're comparing two different languages and translations, right, there should be some standard metrics to compare two different language translators. So I will give you some ideas, like, some common metrics that are typically used for language translation, and we will talk about what are those metrics and how you can judge the suitability or the usefulness of different language translators. And finally, I will also point out the recent research about ChatGPT language translation abilities. And there has been somewhat, a little bit, somewhat not very in-depth, but some research has been put into quantifying the abilities of ChatGPT for language translation, and thus there are some useful nuggets that we can learn from that research. I will point out to that also in this module. Talking about language translation is important to whom and why is it useful? Okay, so many applications that use language translation. One of the primary used areas is basically the international travelers, right? So if you're an international traveler, if you're traveling to a country where you do not know the language of that country, then language translation comes really helpful. Okay, and so that's one of the primary or the number one users of language translation and Google Translator, and in fact in Apple and on Android platforms, you have multiple apps which can also do you language translation instantly, where you speak and the language translation is done for you. Okay, so international travelers on all the apps which does this language translation is one of the key users area of the language translation that we have. Language learner. So if you are learning a new language, right, then this is going to be a pretty useful tool. And for example, let's say in high school in the US, you end up taking other foreign languages, for example Spanish, Chinese, and similarly, if you are in India or other places, if you are learning locally, you end up taking local courses in local language, right? So any person who is learning languages, language translation becomes very, very important. And in fact, ChatGPT is a very useful one with respect to this application now, especially given the recent advances in which they have also created a recent versions where the ChatGPT interface can also speak, right? So pronunciation, even if you're writing correctly, right, whether your pronunciation is correct or not, could be a big issue, and you can use ChatGPT for those purposes. So anyone who is learning languages, new languages, they can interact with language translators like Google Translate or ChatGPT, and they can learn from this process, and they can enhance their knowledge in a completely different language. So anyone who's learning languages is a key for users person for the language translation. Global businesses which are operating across multiple different countries, for example in US, South America, North America, in Canada, or if they're operating in China, India, or in Europe, each of these countries have different languages, and sometimes you have to basically cater to the customer in those countries, and the document and the things or the material that you might have created for you, the main country where you belong, might not be suited to a new country where your global business is operating, and in that setting you might want to translate the documents or other important things that you have with respect to your business, and in that setting language translation becomes very, very important. So anyone who's operating globally typically will tend to use language translation, and for those purposes, Google Translate and ChatGPT could be a useful tool that is there. Okay, students and researchers, right? A lot of students and researchers are coming here studying, right? They have their own languages probably which they have studied before, and that's their main language, and they tend to use a lot of language translation to convert English to their native language so that they can understand the context and the importance of what is being taught or what that is there in the material, right? And also researchers, especially researchers who are working in multiple languages, right? So its focus is to study multiple different languages and so forth and so on. They tend to use language translation a lot, and for those people also this two set of tools are important. And finally, one of the one of the other important business use case for nowadays for language translation is the content creator, right? Now a lot of this creator economy is coming into picture. A lot of people are posting things on YouTube, Facebook, and so forth, right? They might be creating content in a single language, their native language, but if they want to cater globally, right, they need to do translation and customize their customer to other people who have probably a different language. So in that setting also, language translation becomes very, very important, and content creators typically tend to use a lot of language translation. And in this setting, a lot of content creators are nowadays using ChatGPT and Google translations that is out there. Okay. Diplomatic agencies are the final category that I'm putting, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but people who have diplomatic offices in multiple different countries and regions, they tend to use a lot of language translation because their language might be native, and the country in which the diplomatic office is there and the agency is placed might have a completely different language, and in that setting, those type of agencies tend to use a lot of language translation. So these are some of the users, main category of users of language translation who use this kind of service.